Thank you very much, Professor Mookherjee, for joining us. It's wonderful to talk to you. Wonderful to have you with us. This is the Pakistan Institute of Development Economics. I think you know us, so I won't go into a long introduction. It is the oldest think tank in Pakistan, and we have been trying to do a lot of stuff. It's almost, I should say, it's the counterpart of the AERC in India, probably. We try and do a lot of things to help development policy and policy planning in Pakistan. And one of the things that we do is we are trying to arrange a large number of webinars, drawing upon world-class economists like yourself to learn from you whatever we can, because I think part of our responsibility is also to teach our kids here. So what you're going to talk about is really going to help our kids and Pakistanis understand what international trends in economics are, what you are thinking and how they should think about it. And I'm sure lots of people will take your talk and try and do theses on it, try and understand the new paradigms that you're giving us. So I must say it's absolutely a pleasure to have you. Dillip Mookherjee, everybody knows, is a famous economist, very well published. One of the economists in India that we look up to and that we feel is one of our own. We lay claim to you, Dilip, all the time because we think that you are part of us. And we welcome you. We had Bardhan give us a talk just about 2 weeks ago. So Dillip Mookherjee, as I said, is very well published, has been a professor and is a professor at Boston University. He's internationally renowned. He's done some excellent work in many different areas. I won't go into his resume. It's been shared with you. You have you know what he's all about. But I want Dilip to take the maximum time to be able to give us a enriching talk to wake us up. So with that, Dilip, it's over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Haq, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you for inviting me to give this talk. It's a great honor and privilege. I'll talk about, I guess you wanted me to speak on a broad set of themes, which I will: market institutions, governance, and rural development in South Asia. So I'm going to focus mainly on problems of rural development and sustainable development. I will select some policy relevant areas, heavily biased in favor of what I've been working on, what I'm aware of, what my students are working on. I will summarize the results of past research, describe some ongoing research, and highlight areas where new research is needed. And as you probably know, my experience is based on projects in India, Nepal, and Bangladesh. I have been interested in Pakistan for some time. I've tried to initiate some projects there, but they didn't really get off the ground. I'll talk a little bit about that. But I hope, but I don't know much about Pakistan. So let's start with that obvious disclaimer. But I hope that some of what I will talk about, in the rest of South Asia will have some relevance in your context. And I hope it will generate some constructive discussions amongst both researchers and policymakers and most especially students, for them to sort of think about and motivate them. In terms of emphasis, I'm going to focus on policies, the primary focus of which is the alleviation of poverty to improve the well-being of the poorest, the most vulnerable sections of society. And I'm going to be focusing not on policies which are sort of which are very obviously redistributive. These are policies which are not only have the potential to reduce poverty, but also are consistent with economic efficiency, though sometimes they may involve slowing down the rate of GDP growth. Just to reiterate the obvious point, in many contexts, economic efficiency and maximizing growth are not the same thing. And sometimes one needs to encounter and trade off between growth and other objectives. There's not going to be any sort of ideological bias here. A lot of it is going to involve improvements in state capacity or government policies that enhance market mechanisms. So it's not to increase either privatization or the scope of the private sector or vice versa to advance socialism or anything like that. These are very pragmatic approaches that achieve actually twin goals of strengthening state capacity as well as strengthening the basis of market institutions. And finally, I'm not going to be talking about just utopian ideas. I'll refer to policies that have been implemented somewhere in South Asia and therefore are feasible in both a practical sense and politically. So with that as introduction, let me just outline the three main areas I want to talk about. The first is agricultural development, focusing on land property rights and agricultural supply chains. The second will be some aspects of urbanization, actually more to do with the transition from agriculture to industry, land acquisition for urbanization, and the design of safety nets during that process. And the last topic will be environmental resilience, which I'm sure is going to resonate with people in Pakistan, given the devastating floods that you have recently encountered. So I'll talk about both short and long run policies of enhancing resilience. So that's where I'm going. I'm sort of hoping to devote about a roughly equal amount of time to each of the three, but particularly spend time on the third topic. Okay, so let me start with agriculture, and within agriculture, the modernization of land records. So land records are in pathetically backward state in both Bangladesh and in India. Paper records are stored on a plot by plot basis in land records offices, which are based on outdated cadastral surveys. The last cadastral survey in India was in 1940, carried out by the British colonial administration. Since then, there has been no updating of those records. And what is needed instead is data which is organized not just by plot, but by households. The most important thing is to know how much land in aggregate is owned by any given household. And one needs data with updated information about the quality of the land, particularly the irrigation status. And there's an urgent need for records to be computerized so that are not only accurate, that are tamper-proof, and are instantly accessible by multiple users. And this ease of access and credibility of information, as well as the security associated with land titles, promotes market efficiency. So critical in reducing corruption, in reducing conflict and disputes about land, in enhancing property rights and security of ownership. It's important to activate land markets by facilitating transfers of land, borrowing also. So credit access is often based on land collateral, for which, again, proper land titles are necessary. So it promotes market efficiency, but it also is a very important tool for enhancing state capacity. So tax administration, for instance, the government needs to know how much land a household owns. The targeting of social protection and anti-poverty programs. If you have to identify the poor, you have to know who are the poor. And an important aspect of poverty is land poverty. So all of this requires assessments and valuations of assets owned at the household individual level, which is not possible with the way that land records are currently stored. And the importance of this issue will sort of recur at various points later as I go along. Okay, let me now turn to more on land property rights. Talk about some programs that were carried out in the state of West Bengal, which involved not, the focus of these programs was not to take away land from large landowners. The first one was actually land which had already been appropriated from people who owned land above the legal land ceiling. A lot of that land, which is called vested land, is sitting with the government undistributed. And it turns out many Indian states, including West Bengal, have failed to distribute vested land. This land is been appropriated, it is meant to be distributed to landless households, but it is not being distributed. And I've tried to probe why so much land is being held undistributed. It's a bit of a mystery. There is some administrative difficulty, there is some corruption involved in the process, but there is also sometimes a lack of political will. And surprisingly, this was true even in West Bengal under a left front government, which had been elected under a platform of carrying out land reforms and empowering the poor. And so it turned out that Pranab Bardhan, who I believe spoke to you 2 weeks ago, he and I did a lot of work on West Bengal's land systems. So when we did our work, we looked at the period ending from 1978 to 1998. The left front government came in 1977. And even in 1998, vested land, which is this appropriated surplus land, accounted for 16% of all agricultural land, of which only 5.5% had been distributed. So the remaining was just sitting with the government undistributed. But this 5.5% of the land that was distributed was still a large and impressive program. The recipients accounted for 14% of the rural population. And in various studies that we carried out involving surveys, household and land surveys, this significantly lowered local poverty and land inequality. The other program, which the left front government carried out, was the registration of tenants, protecting them from eviction, provided that they were using the land for agriculture, and regulating the minimum share. And this program covered 5% of land area and benefited tenants that constituted about 4% of the rural population. And a number of papers, Abhijit Banerjee, Paul Gertler, and Maitresh Ghatak had a paper in the JPE, and Pranab and I had another paper in the AEJ applied in 2011, showing, and we used panel data at the household level to show that it increased agricultural productivity quite significantly. These two land reforms were complemented in West Bengal. The West Bengal government provided complementary support to small farmers. So once a landless person is given a plot of land, that's not enough. You need to support it with seeds and fertilizers, extension services, which the West Bengal government provided in the form of what are called agricultural mini kits containing seeds and fertilizers at highly subsidized rates. They were provided with bank credit, and then local governments, elected local governments, constructed local infrastructure, complementary local infrastructure, particularly roads and irrigation. And in the work that Pranab and I did evaluating West Bengal productivity growth, actually these programs were even more important than the land programs. So this combination of land programs and agricultural support services helped reduce poverty in West Bengal between the late 1970s and the mid 1990s. West Bengal achieved the highest rates of growth amongst all Indian states during that period. But since the mid 1990s, agricultural yields stagnated because these programs pretty much plateaued at that point. And the fate of, I think, poor households since then has, if anything, been falling over time, partly because the average size of farm holdings have been falling. And so another paper that Pranab and I did tried to understand why that is the case. And we found that the most important contributing factors were the rise in population and subdivision of households. Joint families were breaking up into nuclear families and subdividing the land. And there was also a failure of people to leave agriculture to move to industry because of very sluggish industrial growth. So I'll come to that, the second aspect of urbanization later. So basically, since the mid 1990s, I think the agricultural sector has been stagnating to some extent. This is true for most of India. And one factor that's important is that if you compare growth in agricultural yields between India and China, one reason why China started ahead and has remained ahead is the development of hybrid rice varieties, whose yields are about twice as high as those of even the high-yielding rice varieties in India. And much of much of that success with the development and adoption of hybrid rice in China is due to government R&D. So I think governments also have a big role to play in sponsoring research on hybrid rice varieties. Hybrid rice varieties, these are not fully genetically modified. They're mainly the result of hybridization with a minimal amount of genetic tinkering. Uh, and there is a huge potential here for I think countries in the South Asian subcontinent to increase rice yields, if provided the government puts in enough effort into sponsoring research and then also very importantly encouraging the adoption of these new varieties, testing them. Now, post 2000, I I think part of the agricultural stagnation is also looking at East India more generally. Started looking at problems of credit access and marketing channels. So, with respect to credit access, there's very limited access to formal credit or microcredit. Microcredit is mainly in the form of these self-help groups, which the terms on which credit is granted by microcredit agencies it does not permit the loans to be used for agriculture. Agriculture requires loans which have a duration of at least 3 to 4 months to tide over the time gap between the planting of a crop and the harvesting of the crop. And microcredit doesn't allow that kind of flexibility. Uh, and formal credit is not available to most small farmers because they don't have secure land titles, which they can use for collateral. Uh, so small farmers, I think about 2/3 of all loans to small farmers I found in West Bengal is on the borrowing informal on the informal credit market from money lenders, from traders, from friends and family at substantially higher interest rates. In West Bengal, they were borrowing at an average of about 25% per annum, whereas anybody who had access to bank credit or cooperative credit were borrowing at 12%, at half the cost. The second big constraint small farmers faced was in marketing channels. In Eastern India, most of them do not have access to wholesale markets because wholesale markets are managed by traders associations. They're the mandis. So there are these mandi committees. So India has uh, these agricultural sort of marketing boards, which are controlled by local traders, and they make sure that nobody else can come in and buy crops. So they force farmers to sell to traders, and in fact, most sales are happening at the farm gate. They're selling to small traders in the village. I believe in Pakistan they're called arthiyas. This phenomenon is also very much there in Pakistan. So some research I did try to estimate the margins that are earned by the middlemen. They're really quite astronomical. We looked at potato in West Bengal, and as much as 1/3 of the wholesale price was a lower bound to the margin that was being earned by the middlemen. Moreover, farmers were very poorly informed about price movements in wholesale and retail markets. So, in terms of timing the sale of crop, they were very poorly informed. So, informal traders have high market power. They're often collusive, even if there are many traders within a village. They're often coordinating their purchasing strategies with one another. They also form a powerful political interest group, lobbying regional governments to keep these marketing arrangements in place, which prevent direct procurement from farmers by modern retail conglomerates or multinational corporations. With some colleagues, I've been involved in a series of experiments to evaluate reforms in both credit and marketing channels. So, in a paper we published in the Journal of Development Economics in 2017, we report the results of an RCT, which evaluated a novel microcredit policy, which our thinking was that, well, I mean, given the power of the local money lenders, traders, we have to involve them in any reform program. So our idea was to actually appoint these local trader lenders as credit intermediary agents who are who then are asked to select small farmers for loans which are given at below informal market rates. So as I said, the West Bengal informal market rate was about 25%. So we offered them loans which were charging 18% per annum. Uh, and these were loans which were long duration loans, 4 month loans, and they were designed to help farmers. We combine the loans with some insurance against price risk and yield risk. So if the yields or the prices cause the returns on planting potato to fall relative to historical average by more than 20%, then we forgave the corresponding proportion of the loan. So combination of this, there was a very high take-up of these loans. And these were small loans ranging US $40 to $150. They induced large increases in cultivated area. They induced treated farmers to increase output as well as area allocated to potato, rice, oilseeds, and farm incomes rose by about 25%. We compared this with a similar loan program, loans with the same terms that were delivered by agents who were not trader lenders, but instead appointed by the local government. And a third treatment was to just go with the traditional self-forming borrower groups. And both these alternatives failed to achieve any significant impact on farm incomes. So it seems there is potential for involving intermediaries in the delivery of formal credit through this schemes such as this. The underlying mechanism, we've been spending time trying to understand what enabled this trail program to succeed. Trail agents, partly it happened because they selected high productivity farmers. And then they also provided subsequent help and advice with input procurement and crop marketing to the treated farmers. So it suggests that there is scope for supply chain improvements that co-opt trader intermediaries that are incentivized by their interest in increasing crop procurement from farmers. Because of the high middleman margins, they have incentives to help farmers do whatever it takes to increase output. So I gave a seminar on this sponsored by the IGC, which was in Pakistan. It was also given remotely. State Bank of Pakistan got interested in trail. They actually invited me to come and give a lecture in Islamabad, I forget, 2015 or 2016 or so. They've tried to launch a program like this, but I believe it didn't really materialize. And another sort of proposed supply chain experiment in Pakistan that I had actually written a research proposal with Ghazala Mansouri of the World Bank, but we failed to get funding for this program. So the idea there was allow agro-business firms in Pakistan to directly procure cash crops from small farmers, which would be for export purposes. And in the event of disputes that might arise, contract farming is often marred by disputes on both sides, where there would be a mediation mechanism, and the mediation would occur to the agencies, NGOs like the NRSP in Pakistan and the Punjab Department of Agriculture. I still think it is a very promising idea, and I hope some of you will be interested in pursuing it. Okay, so that's. Let me now turn to the second topic. Just check how well I'm doing for time. Urbanization requires the transfer of land of small farmers quite often. to more productive sectors for either large-scale farming, industry, infrastructure, real estate. Now, there are many impediments to land acquisition. Lack of land titling and registration makes it difficult to identify who owns the land, who to compensate. You don't know how good the quality of land is. You don't know what the appropriate compensation rate is. There are regulations that restrict land sales and rentals. Land holdings are extremely fragmented. So to acquire even a certain amount of land, let's say for a factory or a dam or a big road, you have to deal with thousands and thousands of small owners. And then there are usually problems of negotiation with each small owner doesn't want to give up his land. He wants everybody else to give up their land and so on. Governments have a power of eminent domain to overcome these problems, but acquisition efforts often run into widespread protests from small farmers and indigenous communities. And so it's been documented. So with Maitresh Ghatak, I studied this area in West Bengal called Singur, where Tata was asked to start a car factory, and the West Bengal government used eminent domain to acquire land, about 1,000 acres, and ran into massive problems. And in China also, there have been, in fact, the largest source of protests in China in the last 30 years have been over land acquisition problems, where farmers whose lands were acquired were engaged in visible protests. And if these protests succeed, they succeed much more in democratic countries like India. Urbanization is further impeded by low rural-urban migration of workers, because the farmers hold on to their land, then they don't need to migrate to the city. Now, why is this a problem? Why is land acquisition a problem? One reason is that the land compensation is supposed to be at, let's say, market rates. But often it's not at market rates. In China, there's evidence that the farmers are being paid something like 10 to 20% of the market rate. So that's one problem. In West Bengal, however, this was not a big problem. The government actually compensated farmers at 130% above the market rate. And despite that, protests arose. And so when we researched it and we conducted very detailed household surveys to understand the reasons, what emerged is that a lot of the people who were getting dispossessed valued land not just as a productive asset. There are all kinds of non-productivity sources of land value to poor rural communities. Land provides security, provides insurance against inflation, unemployment, and what we call self-temptation risk. People, if they get a lot of cash, they just feel that they will just spend the cash. Friends and relatives will want to borrow, they'll overspend on their daughter's wedding and so on. Moreover, land is the basis of informal community networks and local status. So it also destroys risk-sharing networks. And of course, land is a source of cultural identity for many. There's a long historical connection. So land is not just a productive asset. And so the personal valuation of land for many of these traditional communities far exceeds the market price of land. And part of the problem is that there's a lack of formal insurance markets. Most of these traditional communities lack access to formal insurance, and they also lack the skills that would be needed in non-agricultural occupations. And given the limited time, is there empirical evidence of insurance value of land? And I just mentioned here, that the studies in Vietnam, studies in West Bengal that we did that point to the insurance value of land. But particularly in China, there's some recent work being done looking at what has happened in China during its process of growth post-1980, that high growth and high urbanization has at the same time been associated with a significant decline in consumption insurance in rural China. And this is more pronounced in areas which were more exposed to loss of agricultural land and collective enterprises. And the implication of this, if land is valued for reasons other than productivity, then even the first principles of microeconomics tells you that welfare optimal and pragmatic land acquisition policies. Pragmatic because if you want the land acquisition to succeed, you have to overcome these protests. And if you do not compensate at the right rate, then people will protest. Uh, so what you need to do is trade off the gains in productive efficiency with non-productivity losses of displaced communities. So this is assuming that you compensate at the market price. And you have to estimate these losses and offer them compensations uh, that do, in fact, include a reasonable compensation for the security that they will lack if they lose the land. And this is very difficult because the non-productivity land benefits are subjective, intangible, and heterogeneous. They differ a lot from household to household. Quite often, it will depend on risk aversion, it will depend on the age profile of the household, and so on. Moreover, you need high quality land records, which is, again, the theme that I started with at the beginning of the lecture. If you don't know if the land is irrigated or not, then you don't know exactly even the productivity value of the land. So you need high quality land records to manage this process well. You also need to design auction-like mechanisms for compensation. So you want farmers to be able to, it's like designing a procurement auction where you ask them how much, at what price are you willing to part with your land? There are a whole host of research and interesting policy questions that I believe have not received enough attention. And related to this, urbanization also requires high rates of rural-urban migration. And people who have been studying migration in India and Bangladesh have been puzzled to understand why it is so low, despite very large incentives for people to migrate, given the gap in wages and productivity between the rural and the urban sector. And some recent research is showing that part of the reason is, again, because of these non-productivity sources of well-being. So Munshi and Rosenzweig, for instance, provide evidence all over India using household level studies that access to insurance through caste networks is an important reason why a lot of people don't want to move from rural areas. And a recent paper by my colleague David Lagakos and Mushfiq Mubarak and so on finds similar evidence from Bangladesh that differences in insurance in urban areas compared to what is available in rural areas is accounting for part of this reluctance for people to move. And the same point is vividly highlighted by large number of migrants in India that were stranded in urban areas following the COVID shock. So suggests that there's a need to improve public safety nets in urban areas for migrants. Migrants have to be eligible for state benefits, health benefits, education benefits, housing benefits in urban areas. Most migrants do not, the state just does not have the capacity to identify migrants, to identify who is eligible, and then also to provide the capacity to cater to these needs. So this is another interesting and challenging area for research and policy design. Okay, now I turn to the third major topic, which is resilience to environmental shocks. So as we all know, the incidence of unstable weather-related crisis appears to be rising all over the world, and this is partly associated with climate change. South Asian countries are particularly vulnerable to droughts and floods, with devastating effects on production, consumption, and health of vulnerable rural communities. So growing importance to develop strategies of adaptation to these environmental risks, which involve both short-term relief for affected communities as well as long-term mitigation strategies. It's probably one of the biggest emerging new problem of research and policy in development. So let me focus on droughts and floods. Undeniable that this is partly due to global climate change, but that is not the only cause. The deterioration of regional ecologies is also responsible. And let me focus just on two important uh, uh, problems. One is deforestation, and the other is groundwater depletion. We need to understand the processes, these processes of deforestation and groundwater depletion, in order to understand long-term adaptation mitigation strategies. So let me start with deforestation, which I have been studying for some time in the Nepalese and the Indian Himalayas. Historically, there's been a decline in forest cover since the mid-19th century, with the appropriation and felling of trees by British colonial authorities to build the railways and to build housing. This process continued after independence. Forest area declined, World Bank estimates 1.2% per year in Asia. And for instance, in Nepal, forest cover declined from 57 to 23% between 1947 and 1980. In India, there's been some controversy over the trends in forest cover. The Indian government's estimates show a decline between 1951 and 1999, but satellite-based evidence between 71 and 99 by Foster and Rosenzweig in a QJE paper in 2003 shows some improvement, partly because of, I believe, planting of new forests by commercial interests. Now, to the extent that forest cover is declining, it owes to increasing encroachment of forest boundaries by extension of agricultural cultivation and felling of timber. And this is offset by planting of new forests. Now, I want to focus on, apart from deforestation, which deals with aggregate forest area, uh, much of which is measured nowadays with satellite-based data. These do not adequately capture forest quality. And that comes up much more clearly in ground level studies of forest ecology. And I was involved in a series of studies of the mid-Himalayan forests in northern India, two districts. We actually surveyed with ecologists, with the help of ecologists, about something like 650 forests, which were randomly selected in that region. And these showed evidence of increasing forest degradation between 1970 and 2000. And this degradation is manifested by the lopping of branches, low canopy cover, stunted tree growth, and low forest regeneration, which is measured by the density of new saplings on the forest floor. Now, this degradation, so the question is, which is more important, degradation versus deforestation? And our ecology and household surveys that we conducted in those areas. So we conducted household surveys of neighboring populations. The degradation reflects mostly the increasing reliance of neighboring households on the forest for firewood and fodder. And in some ways, the degradation seemed much more associated with increasing household demand for firewood. So there was a 60% increase in time reported by households needed to collect firewood between 1975 and 2000. But of this, only a 10% increase was attributed for the time it took them to walk from their houses, which hadn't changed, to the forest boundary. So the receding forest boundary was only accounting for 1/6 of the overall problem. The vast majority was the increased time taken inside the forest to find the firewood. Because the forest had degraded, they had to go further and further inside the forest to cut down the branches. And moreover, our ecology estimates of the source of loss of forest biomass we found was mostly accounted by the lopping of branches rather than the felling of trees. Now, the ecological consequences of degradation as well as shrinking forests results in the weakening of roots and soil, which in turn implies there's increased runoff of snow and rainwater from mountains and hillsides, which in turn implies a drop in the capacity of the ground to retain the water. And this aggravates the dryness of the soil in warm, dry seasons. So if the land does not retain the water when the rainfall happens, What used to happen in old times is that the rainfall would be absorbed into the ground and would be released gradually over time through the soil to replenish the groundwater reserves downstream. But if the water is not being retained on the hillside, the water is sort of flowing down immediately. The weakening of the soil also results in soil erosion, resulting in landslides. And finally, increases the water salinity as well as siltation in rivers. And these problems are sufficiently strong that ecologists, for instance, blame the 1988 devastating floods in Bangladesh on the deforestation that had occurred in Nepal over the previous quarter century. So this increases the likelihood of droughts and floods downstream. So to arrest this process, one needs to understand, if you want to understand the drivers of forest degradation, you have to understand the sources of demand, of household demand for firewood and fodder. And so co-authors, with a number of co-authors, Jamani Baland and others, we did a series of cross-sectional household surveys, both in Nepal and in the northern parts of India. And the early studies were based on cross-sectional household surveys. And what we found is that the cross-sectional elasticities with respect to the population size, for instance, the number of households in adjacent villages, as well as living standards, which is per capita consumption of households, the elasticities both with respect to population size and living standards was near approximately 1. So it suggested that the role of the growth in population and living standards of neighboring populations, because of fast economic and population growth, had resulted in increasing pressure on the forests. However, there are a number of moderating factors. In particular, the source of higher living standards matters. So forest pressure is aggravated if the local asset stocks, or the growth in asset stocks, is biased in favor of livestock or farmland. And to the extent that the growth is being driven by rising education, non-farm assets, or outmigration, then it is moderated. It is also moderated if households have access to modern energy substitutes, for instance, LPG gas cylinders. And it is also moderated if the local community has control over forest management in the form of forest user groups. So to confirm this, we were hoping to use household panel data, which we managed to get hold of from the World Bank, which conducted part of the household living standards measurement survey in Nepal has a panel component. We managed to get them to part with that data. And we merged it with satellite-based forest measures for Nepal. And so studying the 2 successive rounds of the LSMS between 2003 and 2010 provided more reliable evidence of the dynamic process. So the satellite-based forest measures of forest vegetation, we were extremely surprised, showed no change whatsoever between 2003 and 2010. And this finding was corroborated in the household surveys, which showed that there had been a 7% rise in the number of households. Population growth was still going very fast, but it was offset exactly by a 7% fall in per household firewood collections. So then we tried to use the household survey to understand why per household collections fell. And they fell owing to a change in occupational patterns. Local households were shifting away from livestock and farming towards non-farm occupations. There was a significant rise in education and outmigration. And finally, there was a significant increase in the role of local forest user groups. So this evidence suggests 3 policy options to arrest deforestation and degradation. First is community forest rights. So a number of other papers have studied also the effect of forest user groups. And I think almost all studies are showing a pretty significant, stable 10 to 12% decline in household firewood demand. Uh, and these forest user groups raise forest regeneration rates via planting programs. A second alternative policy option is to subsidize alternative energy sources. LPG subsidies in North India, we found, which these subsidies were about rupees 100 per cylinder, which was one third of the cost, estimated to lower household firewood use by 20 to 27%. And then, of course, the third prong of the strategy could be education and other ways to encourage the diversification of rural livelihoods away from farming and livestock towards non-farm service occupations and outmigration. The second topic I'd like to talk about is groundwater use and management. So groundwater levels are shrinking at an alarming rate throughout India. And the causes are partly the rising demand for water use, which is often largely unregulated. People are just sinking their own wells and using pumps that are going deeper and deeper, more and more powerful pumps, and often subsidized by the government through state procurement of water-hungry crops, as well as giving farmers access to cheap electricity for these pumps. Secondly, both state and private actors, their attitude towards water is basically extract, extract, extract. And there's a corresponding lack of effort to harvest rainwater and restore local watersheds. And the whole approach to water has been a very top-down command and control method based on large-scale hydroelectric projects and canals, which actually reach a very small fraction of population. In the areas that I've studied, only 8% of farmers have benefit to water from government canals. So they have undermined, but the existence of this very, top-down command and control system of water management has undermined the scope for local communities to regulate water use and manage water stocks. There's a much stronger tradition of this in South India. So this gives rise to interest in watershed restoration projects, and this is happening worldwide. So in the US, for instance, just currently, when I looked at various websites of the US government on water, the US government, the Department of Interior has approved 90 watershed projects spanning 19 states, which cover 206 square miles, all the way from around the Rocky Mountains, Arizona, Utah, all the way to California. But there are also covering northeastern states, my own state, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and so on. There have been a vast increase in watershed projects in sub-Saharan Africa in the last 30 years. Ghana, Nigeria, South Africa, Zimbabwe, and most notably recently Ethiopia, this land management program, which is sponsored by the World Bank, involving 135 watersheds covering over 860,000 acres. And India also, there have been about 100 watershed projects since the 1990s, which have been sponsored by the government as well as ICRISAT. Now, to my surprise, I looked for efforts by economists to evaluate the impact of these projects, and there are surprisingly few rigorous, well-identified studies of the impacts of these projects. There are a number of case studies that have been carried out using cross-sectional evidence, which are subject to all the usual caveats about identification. But what evidence there is suggests high average rates of return, high impacts on agricultural productivity and rural incomes, because to the extent that the watershed is restored, ground aquifers are increased, the soil moisture goes up, and agricultural yields go up. But also that watershed projects are highly heterogeneous in their impacts. And nobody really understands why one watershed project succeeds and the other one doesn't. So one of my ongoing projects now is to do a rigorous evaluation of a watershed project. I'm working with an NGO, a large NGO, which is also in turn working with local community members, members of the village. So this is in the hills of Jharkhand in central India. So the purpose of the watershed is to store rainwater in the form of large tanks and ponds, and most importantly, channel the water flow into a single stream down the river, involving exercises such as gully plugging, construction of check dams, and contour trenches. These are designed to enhance the water retention capacity of the soil, to replenish below ground water stock, and slow the water flow during the monsoons. And this is going to cover an area of about 25 square kilometers. It'll be held over the next 5 years. We'll be monitoring the impacts on soil moisture, water levels in the streams and ponds, local vegetation, crop yields, and farm incomes using household surveys as well as satellite data. And we have to have an identification strategy. So we are comparing the treated area with a neighboring control area using difference of difference analysis. And finally, the other kind of research which I think is very important is on short-term disaster relief. Droughts and floods necessitate short-term relief, obviously, and the responsibility usually rests with the government, even in developed countries. And the relief can take form of cash transfers and in-kind assistance, nutrition, medicines, housing, farm subsidies, local infrastructure in the reconstruction process. Now, you would think geographic targeting should be straightforward because of the availability of good data on precipitation and surface water levels and soil moisture. Yet, despite the availability of good data, studies in India show significant anomalies in targeting. In West Bengal, for instance, I have an ongoing project. We find that household benefits that are disbursed by local governments are totally non-responsive. It's a well-identified zero, the responsiveness to measures of excess or deficient rainfall. A student of mine, Lisa Tarquinio, she just did her PhD recently looking at drought relief in 3 South Indian states. She found that in South India, relief was responsive to droughts, but in an imperfect way. So 1/3 of areas that satisfied the official definition of drought did not actually receive relief. While on the other hand, 1/3 of the areas that did receive relief did not have a drought. And she provides credible evidence of political economy motives in drought relief declarations, the bias in favor of swing constituencies to increase the chances of winning the next election. So I think there are many important questions that need to be explored by researchers. What is the effectiveness of cash or in-kind support in smoothing the impact of environmental shocks on household consumption, on production, on incomes, on health and investments? Second, what is the possible adverse impacts on location or settlement patterns? So one problem with providing generous assistance to people in affected areas is that it may create a moral hazard problem. Communities may actually need to be moved from excessively eco-fragile areas to less eco-fragile areas. And so there may be a long-term moral hazard problem associated with it. There are a number of interesting studies in the US looking at this. There's a job market candidate on the market this year, Peng He from Penn State, who's looking at this in the context of relief against hurricanes in Texas. And this leads back to a deeper and more difficult long-term resettlement policy design. If people have to be moved from threatened areas to less threatened areas, where should they be moved? How should they be moved? The government has to play a very important role in this whole resettlement process. Okay, so that's all that I had to say. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I've gone over a little bit. Thank you very much for your patience, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you, Dilip. Thank you very much. That is a wonderful talk. Really appreciate it. Really appreciate the way you've looked at things in great depth and over a long period of time and summarized everything. That's really beautiful, wonderful, very good job. But Dilip, I'd like to run by you what our thesis at Pide did and see if you can sort of connect that to what's in India, or whether you can shoot holes in our thesis. Our thesis seems to converge on this, what we've been looking at, that the problem is that we are totally market unfriendly. In all these years, we have developed no markets in agriculture whatsoever. The government is still buying wheat, the government is setting prices, land distribution, the government, as you said, does not even update land rights, nor does it transfer land. The transaction costs in transferring land are fairly high. Even the transaction costs in getting property rights are fairly high. There's a Land Alienation Act that really does not allow large land holdings to be broken up. Land reforms, we did a wash on them. And so on and so forth. Even urban areas, for example, we've heavily regulated our urban areas. So because we've heavily regulated our urban areas, we don't allow, for example, flat construction, commercial construction, school construction. We haven't allowed those, which has created a huge demand for real estate outside the cities in terms of housing estates, and it's created a huge sprawl in the country. So when you look at that, the whole process seems to be an extreme aversion to developing markets. And where does this process come from? When you look at it, the process comes from the old colonial bureaucracy and the judiciary that are still around and that have this, aversion to local initiative, aversion to local markets, and they're very suspicious and they will not allow things to happen. But related to that is the fact that the colonial bureaucracy, which is supposed to be a revenue bureaucracy, has now been put into doing the development work for the World Bank and other places. So they are so busy doing development work that they've forgotten their old revenue record and magisterial work. So with the result that we've created this huge mess. So when one market fails, we try and compensate by giving subsidies on something in another market. So we are running around madly trying to fix the system. But the fundamental reform that in our thesis that needs to take place is overhauling the colonial system to a more market-based system. How would you react to that?
No, I can believe that. I think that makes a lot of sense. But I think the way you do it, assuming that you can get going with that process, the question is how exactly should it be designed? And I think for instance, the problems that I was talking about, if you move from state procurement to market-based supply chains, then, which I believe you have, market-based supply chains are important in Pakistan. I understand. Small farmers are selling large, for instance, cash crops, I would imagine, is not being procured by the government. Is that correct? And much of the potential for growth is going to come from development of cash crops. So how are those supply chains markets? How will those markets be set up? How will those markets need to be regulated in some way? How do you encourage competition? So I think to the extent that small farmers are really do not have the option of selling to people outside, traders outside the village, I think that's an important problem of competition, of ensuring competition in the market that is to evolve. If they go to the market, if they go to the mandi, then I think quite often the mandis are extremely, in India, they vary a lot, but there are lots of mandis in eastern India, for instance, have antiquated weighing equipment. The procedure by which the crop is sold varies a lot. There are still, in eastern India, a lot of it is based on handshake transactions rather than open auctions. So somebody has to, create modern markets. And who is going to create those modern markets? Who's going to supervise those markets? Disputes occur. Who's going to resolve those disputes? How will those disputes be resolved? So I think those are all important issues. Mm-hmm. With respect to transfer of lands, I talked about land acquisition. It's vitally important for growth. So maybe, if you're still caught in an antiquated colonial system where, which is not allowing for transfer of land to more productive users, that's very important. But you also have to think about resistance to that process that may arise, as is arising elsewhere in India and China, and how to manage that process adequately. And what you want to do is facilitate that process by trying to understand what compensations have to be offered to farmers when their land is appropriated, how they're resettled. Maybe you want to couple it with the development of safety net mechanisms. How much growth there should be is itself is something that needs research. You have to understand the costs and benefits of growth. And you want to make sure that those who are losing as a result of the growth process are adequately compensated. Uh, you want to, you don't want to do everything that the West did. There was a lot of misery along the way. When in the enclosure movement in England, all the poor were basically, they lost access to the land and were forced to go to the cities. And, the misery associated with that process was unbelievable. So I think we need a more enlightened approach to market development than was the experience in sort of the early industrializers.
But deliberately related to that is the issue that urban migration, as you said, has been slow. But in one sense, the urban migration has been slow, primarily because we heavily regulated the cities. And we, for a start, for example, we did not allow any serious, in Pakistan I'm talking about, we did not allow any serious construction in Pakistan. The last serious hotel that was built was in 1960. After that, we allowed no hotels to be built. The last serious tower that we allowed was not allowed to be built. There were no shopping malls, nothing was allowed to be built. So in a sense, there was no incentive to migrate. However, we've seen that there's a large migration that has taken place, if not from the rural, so Harris Todaro is redeemed. Even though Harris Todaro used to be the fundamental theorem of development, and yeah, urban-rural migration is very important development. So we did not allow urban migration, rural migration at home. But in one sense, it took place because a large number of our rural people migrated overseas. So they went to Dubai, Saudi Arabia, Europe, US, everywhere. And they're the ones who are sending remittances back, and they're the ones who alleviated poverty. However, through this process, the state has been kind of inert. They've not been able to do anything other than sit around and watch. And they have not created any market. The way we look at it is, for example, even in terms of land, if only the state, as you said, could get titles going, if only they could ensure that we have proper property rights. For example, in all our cities, most of our cities, only Karachi is a outlier. In all our cities, we still don't have a multiple ownership law. We still don't have, for example, all these new housing societies that come up. They give you a title. The state doesn't give you a title. So the titling system is a complete mess. We still have common land that there are vague laws like if you enclose the common land, then you own the common land. And so there's a huge rush to try and get the common land. So they're all kind of crazy things. But the government has neither the attention span nor the desire to look at that, because the government is too busy trying to get development aid. And they're running after money. And these simple reforms will probably wait another century before they happen. But at the same time, Dilip, I think I also see that academia doesn't talk about these things. Academia has never talked about the markets here, the state of markets, nor have any experiments been done on the state of markets, nor about, I was very happy to hear what you said about, land records and agricultural markets and credit markets, etc. But we look at it much more from the individual side through service, but we don't really look at the market side or the market infrastructure. For example, again, talking about Pakistan, the seed market is controlled by the government. Government also control the sugarcane market. So when it comes to the small farmer planting, the choices are very few. And if they plant cash crops, the infrastructure for taking the cash crops to the market are not there. For example, flowers, they can't take the flowers to the market, or even fruit, for example. Yeah, there's some fruit. And the fruit can only travel short distances. Tomatoes, for example, there are stories of tomatoes being wasted. In the northern area, there are stories of apricots being wasted because they just don't have the capacity to bring it to the south where the demand is. So, I mean, all these things, somehow, we don't have studies, and nobody's looking at the macro picture. Everybody's looking at the individual picture. And the bureaucrats have no incentive. The judiciary doesn't understand. So we're in a deep mess. And unless we reform this governance structure, I don't think the markets will come. So what's your reaction to that?
Yeah, so in each context, I think you're talking about potatoes or sugarcane and so on. Infrastructure is obviously critical when it comes to perishables. So you need cold storages, you need good transport, you need good roads. Some of that is, storage could, in India, for instance, when I look at potato in West Bengal, most of the storage, the investment is private. But the roads obviously are not going to be built by private parties. So there has to be you have to think about, again, talking about market infrastructure. Oh, perhaps there are going to be public-private partnerships here, strategies for developing the infrastructure, financing private investment in infrastructure, uh, strategies for farmers to gain access to modern technology, seeds, fertilizers. Uh, who's you want to let the private sector do as much of that as is possible, but in that process, you've got to have a whole set of new actors come into contact with farmers. You need the first best situation is for agro-business. And I believe there is an active agro-business community in Pakistan interested in exporting cash crops. Uh, but they don't seem to be connected to small farmers. So how do you make that connection happen? Uh, how do you ensure, for instance, let's say you have an agro-business firm that wants to contract with a set of farmers to deliver potatoes or sugar. You have to, so they're going to maybe give them the seeds. They're going to give them some credit. But what if the farmers don't deliver? What if the farmers don't know how to use the seeds? What if the farmers take the loans and then run away with the money? What is going to be the enforcement mechanism of these arrangements? So market development is going to require complementary mechanisms for dealing with attendant disputes. There has to be some kind of a machinery, which is why I was talking about this program that Ghazala and I were interested in experimenting with in Pakistan. So it's going to require, a combination of private investment with some kind of public engagement in attendant infrastructure problems, in the enforcement mechanisms that will enable small farmers to gain access to the credit, to the technology, so that they can participate in the market economy.
Okay, let me go to the floor.
Yeah.
Dr. Mubarak Ali, former member Planning Commission, one of our famous agricultural, researchers. Dr. Saab, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nadeem Saab. I have real opportunity to know from you what happened to the market reforms that Modi government has promised, but then I think they back off or not with the pressure of the farmers' demonstrations. It looks the marketing problem are similar in India and Pakistan. I think there was a lot of promises. There was promising reforms that Modi government was trying to make, but then there was big demonstration happens. So what is the status of those reforms? Is really withdrawn or it's still going to be implemented? That's one question. I have one more question is, I think we normally give little importance to the value chain development in agriculture. You are talking about linking the agriculture business communities directly with the farmers so that they can directly purchase from the farmers. In Pakistan, for example, some exporters are trying to buy mangoes directly from the farmers or citrus from the farmers, but their experience is that only 15 to 20% of the total lot they buy is suitable for export. So they have to really sort out, and remaining 80%, they have to sell it in the domestic market. Only 20% they can get it from the total lot. The problem is, I think we are not properly training the farmers to produce the quality products. And who will do that? Whether those agribusiness, for example, supermarkets, we have many good supermarkets in Pakistan as well as in India as well. I don't know the status in India, but in Pakistan, these supermarkets are buying their produce from the wholesale market. rather than from the market, from the farmers, and train them to produce the quality they wanted, right? They are going directly to the markets. So I think the main problem is in the value chain development, which is very important to increase the agriculture exports, to increase the income of the farmers by developing value chains and by increasing value additions and processing, that type of thing, is to train the farmers to produce the quality. And nobody is doing that, at least in Pakistan. So that's why we fail to produce for the market. We fail to produce for the quality markets, and we are producing for the traditional markets at the low prices, right? I think the main problem at this point is how to address the quality in production and how to do the value chain. And that's not happening nowhere. It's happening in Pakistan, at least. So
Thanks,
the question is how we can do that.
Go ahead, Dilip. You two questions.
Thank you. Yeah, no, the situation sounds very similar to the Indian context that I was talking about in Eastern India. I think, yeah, so the traditional supply chain is not working precisely because farmers, do not get a sufficient return on their crop because of the high middleman margins, which in turn is due to the lack of competition. And second, they do not have access to modern varieties. They don't know, how to plant new varieties. They don't have access to modern varieties, and a lot of the modern varieties will require new investments, which will require credit. So you need this whole access to modern varieties from producers who have the opportunity to sell it to markets which value high quality. So you're absolutely right. I agree with you 100% that improving quality is essential. And improving quality is a big challenge because the combination of lack of access to technology, lack of skill, lack of credit for the small farmer, and it should all be a market-based process. So you should have the agribusiness firms that are vital intermediaries in this process who have access to the marketing channels and the advertising channels, the export contacts, or even the the supermarket chains, for instance, maybe selling in cities to more affluent customers who value quality, who are willing to pay substantial premium for high quality mangoes, for instance. But then we have to have the supply chain come forward. And the supply chain, the farmers by themselves do not have the know-how, they do not have the seeds, they do not have the varieties, they do not have the credit. So that has to be provided to them by the agribusiness firms. And this whole contract farming thing has to proceed on the basis of collaboration. That is not possible under the existing system. So I agree with you 100%. And this is why I think it's vital to think of how to encourage buyers, large agribusiness buyers, to be able to procure directly from small farmers. But you also need, in that situation, to provide a governance mechanism. Contract farming, is working to a large extent in many developing countries, but it runs into roadblocks because of problems of governance of contract farming arrangements. So quite often there are problems of developing trust. There's problems of moral hazard. And so there you need some kind of a regulatory governance mechanism to ensure the resolution of disputes. So for instance, when it comes to quality, there has to be a mechanism to check the quality of delivered mangoes. The buyer, even if he gets good mangoes, could have an incentive to complain that the mangoes are not good and use that as a pretext to not pay the price that was promised. So then you have to have a dispute resolution mechanism. And so it just is not going to, the market transaction is not going to happen on its own. You need a governance mechanism for the resolution of disputes. You need third parties to measure, the quality, and then decide on what is a fair price. So all of this is equally important to the development of the market. So I agree with you entirely. With respect to the farm reforms in India, what happened? The government, yes, backtracked in a very significant way. I think the reforms were justified from an economic standpoint. There's been excessive procurement of grains like wheat and rice, aggravated environmental problems. Rice is not really suitable in many North Indian. It's a water-hungry crop. It's contributed to the environmental problem of shrinking groundwater. And the system was really benefiting large farmers and traders. So part of the government's reforms were exactly to move in the direction that I was suggesting, to increase competition and to reduce this excessive subsidization of inappropriate crops. But the farmers were it was basically a large farmer lobby. The lobby did not represent the interests of small farmers. But the government, it was just, they could not deal with the political problem created by the farmer protests, and they backed down. And nobody really knows. They just promised to withdraw the bill or to postpone it, but the farmers were then demanding that it actually not be postponed, but it be dropped altogether. And the government hasn't responded to that. So it's kind of in a state of limbo. That's where it is.
Nasser Iqbal Saab, Nasser sponsored the seminar,
Yeah.
got into Dilip. So Nasser, go ahead.
Thank you so much. So there are a couple of questions. One is, given this current use of technology, do you still feel that this asymmetric information would have any role in terms of expanding these market? And secondly, if we look into the way this financial side play a role, especially when you ask about the credit and the lack of credit they have. No, there are different means to get some sort of collateral to kick off this process, especially if you look into the way this technology is used to monitor the collateral. So do you still believe that these are the two binding constraints in terms of expanding the value chain and the way this rural market works?
Sorry, your first point I didn't really understand. Can you just elaborate a little bit more?
Yeah, this basically, when we talk about the price differential that you said, that the between the middleman and the farmer and the wholesale market is primarily due to the lack of complete set of information, because they don't know the what's price actually in the end user. So when we have the technology, basically it enables everyone to get the right, to actually know the price which is prevailing in the market. And if you have that type of information, why still they are selling at the low price to the middleman?
Okay, so we actually did an experiment providing information to the small farmers about the mandi price. What is the prevailing mandi price? We actually it's hard. Okay, so first we had to figure out what the mandi price was. And the mandi sort of meets every evening at 7 p.m. There is a kind of negotiated mandi price, but it is only known to leading participants in the mandi, and it is not public information. And small farmers don't get to know what the mandi price is prevailing. So we actually bribed some of the research team. We bribed people in the mandi, traders in the mandi, to tell us what the price was, and then we gave cell phones to small farmers. And we had a whole sort of phone relay booth sitting in Calcutta, which were calling farmers all over West Bengal to tell them what the price was in their local mandi in the previous day. We carried out this experiment for over 2 years, 2007, 2008. So farmers were now better informed about the prevailing mandi price. To our surprise, and in fact, to the surprise of the small farmers, initially, when we piloted this scheme, the small farmers felt that this would be a vital in their ability to bargain in trading with the local trader when selling their potato at the farm gate. To our surprise, the effect was the average treatment effect of this experiment. This was an RCT. The average treatment effect was exactly 0 on the price that the farmers received. And the short answer is that information by itself is not going to do much if you do not have access to selling in the mandi yourself. So the critical problem was the lack of competition. Information by itself will not solve the problem. You need a combination of information and methods to open up the mandi for farmers to sell directly in the mandi. So the problem was the contact between farmers and buyers in the mandi. And that contact is prevented by the regulatory arrangement with the way that the mandi is set up. So it was ultimately, you need both information and competition. So information programs, in fact, there have been studies in other parts of India where farmers do have access to selling in the mandi. There was a paper by Aparajita Goel who looked at Madhya Pradesh. There were these e-chowpals that were set up in the late 1990s. And that actually ended up having an effect on the price that the farmers were getting at the farm gate. But on the other hand, in Maharashtra, there was another study by Fafchamp and Minton, which was through Reuters. They gave price information to farmers, and that also had a zero effect. So and there are other problems with selling in the mandi in Maharashtra. They do hold procurement auctions, but those procurement auctions, there's also evidence of collusive behavior. So again, I think so. It's information by itself is not going to solve the problem. You will still need measures to deal with competition in agricultural markets. That's really fundamental.
Good point. Zishan.
A very wonderful presentation. I have a question. You rightly mentioned that the mandi mechanism is not very efficient, and the most of the profit share is taken by the middleman. Do you think that e-commerce has potential to establish an alternative mandi where we could link the farmers with the potential buyers, and it has the potential to reduce the role of the middleman? Thank you.
Thank you. Very good question. Yeah, that there are lots of problems. There is potential, but there are huge problems in realizing that potential. And let me tell you what the problem is. I've talked to, commodity market exchanges in India that are very keen to encourage to expand the volume of business, and they particularly would like small farmers to be able to participate directly in the exchange, in futures markets, for instance. The government is also interested. The government has been setting up, Indian government has been setting up e-portals and so on. But those are going nowhere for the simple reason that a small farmer, if he wants to enter first he needs access to the exchange. But to participate in an exchange, in a futures market, you have to put a substantial collateral. The collateral that's required to participate in, let's say, MCX, which is one of these commodity exchanges in India, is 5 lakhs, rupees 5 lakhs. It's beyond the capacity of any small farmer to be able to get a license for rupees 5 lakhs to participate in the exchange. But there's a very good reason why that rupees 5 lakhs is required, because you could promise to deliver and not actually deliver. It's back to the old problem of moral hazard. So in fact, what you need is some mechanism. Again, I think an interesting idea that was provided by ICICI, big bank in India, which was interested in this problem, is to again create these intermediary agents. You get local traders to form an intermediary agent. So local farmers can place trades on the exchange through the intermediary. And in fact, the RCT that I told you about, the trail RCT, which was a pure credit RCT, originally it was designed to be not just access to credit, but also access to the commodity exchange. But in 2008, there was a crisis in India. There was a microcredit crisis in India, and the Reserve Bank of India banned that kind of arrangement. So there were these credit franchises that were being rolled out by ICICI at that time to allow farmers to place trades on the commodity exchange through the local intermediary agent. And that was just outlawed by the Reserve Bank. But I think it's that kind of idea is needed. So in short, yes, there is huge potential, but this is the problem with realizing that potential. You still need an intermediation mechanism for small farmers to be able to access these market exchanges.
Thank you, Dr. Nadeem. My experience from from Taiwan, Korea, and Japan is that to link the farmers, small farmers directly with the market, the collection points in the rural area is critical. I think in these countries, they have established collection points in rural areas where there's a small storage, and they have mechanisms to grade, to pack, and to wash the commodities. And then those traders come to those collection points to make the deal. These collection points are mostly owned by the farmers' associations, farmers' cooperatives. So those traders come to those collection points and make the deal with those cooperatives. In this way, the markets are brought at the rural level, rather than farmers have to go bring their commodities in the urban centers. So I think establishing these collection points is very, very critical, and that needs usually the support from the governments. The government provides managerial and technical support to run these centers to those cooperatives, and then those traders have to make the deals. And now in Pakistan, in certain markets, this is happening also. For example, in carrots in Pakistan, there's a collection points where they wash the carrots, right? So all the farmers bring their carrots at those points to get the carrot washed. And the trader knows that all the carrots comes at that collection points. So they start making the deal, they start coming at those collection points, make the deal directly with the farmers or with the group of farmers. So I think that my experience shows that these collection points are very critical in linking the small farmers directly to the markets. Rather than farmers go, traders come to the rural areas, and you bring the markets in the rural areas.
Yes. No, I agree with that entirely. That makes a lot of sense. And I see that in India, in places where the market is working reasonably well. It is based on something like that. So, for instance, in potato, in these two districts that I studied, there are cold stores that are, again, these are large traders, large farmers that have invested in creating these cold stores. The farmers, they bring their potato and store it in the cold store. And when they want to sell, the buyers come to the cold stores. And they'll negotiate a price beforehand with the farmer, and then they will bring out the potato from the cold store, and then they will have to thaw the potatoes. The potatoes are lying outside, so it allows the buyers to inspect the potatoes, and then they finalize the price later in the day. And this happens throughout the year. So indeed, this is exactly what you're saying. These cold stores are located, almost every village that is growing potato has a cold store within 3 or 4 miles. So the farmer only has to take the potato to the cold store instead of having to go to the mandi, which can be much further away. Also, the e-chopals in Madhya Pradesh, which ITC had started, was something like the credit franchisee that I was telling you about. ITC stood ready to buy. So this is like big agribusiness that are setting up a chain to directly buy from the farmers through these credit franchisees. The credit franchise, the trader intermediary is sitting in a booth. There's a booth, this is a little room with a ticker tape, which is showing the price that is prevailing in the market, in the organized market. It's a point at which farmers can come and find out what the prevailing price is. And there is also a quoted price for ITC to buy a given cash crop from them. And the farmers, all they have to do is they have to bring their crop to that point at the credit franchisee's booth. So that's exactly, again, so these are instances of two mechanisms, mostly private, which essentially are bringing the market to the farmer instead of the farmer taking the produce to the market.
Okay, great. Thank you. Dilip, one quick question. I also worry about it, the fact that these farmers who, as I said, have shown extreme sagacity in terms of international migration, the small farmers, and we've seen that from all over Pakistan, for example. Azad Kashmir, Sindh, Balochistan, everywhere they've gone overseas and they have got their well-being by moving overseas. Yet I don't understand, why do they remain small farmers? Why don't they sell their plot of land and move up? Why is land consolidation not taking place? That puzzles me. One reason, of course, is they want population is growing, urban centers are growing, and they think that they can come near the urban center, and the incentive for land acquisition or getting into the urban center increases, because if your land happens to come to the periphery of a town, and towns, as I said, in Pakistan are increasing. We are now almost 80% urbanized, even though the census doesn't show it. That's because of a definitional problem. But everybody is speculating on the fact that my land will become urban, and I will. So they're hanging on to these small crops. Maybe, I'm not sure. But the issue is, isn't it fundamentally irrational to hang on to a 5-acre farm? Because the average farm size in Pakistan, according to the census, is 5 acres. If you take out the big farms, there are many big farms because we haven't done land reform. But the 5-acre farm seems to be now maybe even less, 3-acre farm standard. And yet these guys are not selling out. What explains that?
Yeah, that's a good research question. We should, yeah, that sounds fascinating question. Yes. Yeah, so they have the wealth, I guess. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, usually they have some family members who are there. I mean, when they migrate, it's the entire family hasn't moved. So you've got, maybe your elderly mother, or you have some siblings who are still living there, who are carrying out some cultivation. And, they have to live somewhere, right? And they have a traditional association with that plot of land. So there could be this non-productivity source of land benefit that I was saying. So it is security. It's, maybe you've got a brother who's, didn't complete high school, and he's, yeah. And then the speculative motive could be there, is if the land value is going up with development. I don't know. It's a really interesting question. Yeah.
I think Dr. Mubarak really has some answer. Dr. Mubarak, do you want to give your answer before we close?
I just want to first tell you the situation that we compared land transactions that is happening in 1 year in China versus in Pakistan, and estimated that per million hectares transactions, which is about 1/10 what is happening in China. It means land transaction is changing hands. Land from one hand to another is very small in Pakistan. And Dr. Mookherjee has indicated some of the reasons of that is non-productive values of land, which is beyond the productivity prices of the land. But I think in Pakistan especially, it's true because the land record is very poor, and making the transaction is very, very uphill task. People do not know exactly what is their land, because the original ownership of the land is in their grandfather's name. They haven't transferred it to their son and to their grandson and to their grandson. So they really do not know who owns the land. It is owned by their grandfather. And once you wanted to sell that land, you have to go to all those grandsons and daughters to get the permissions to sell those land because of the inheritance law. So I think it's the land record is poor, land transaction is very, very cumbersome, and there are other productive values of land associated with the land ownership, political power with the land ownership, as well as many others. So I think main problem here, there is one study in India where they have improved the land record to computer, and they say you can make transactions through computers. I think it is near somewhere in Bombay, and there was significant increase in the land transactions by doing so. So I think if really some want to make the agriculture more efficient and in more efficient hands, they have to improve the land record system. That's the first point.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Mubarak. Dilip, any last thoughts?
No, I'm just struck by how similar the problems are and how similar the contexts are. So there's a lot to learn from each other. So thank you for this opportunity to exchange ideas and also to learn from all of you, some of the problems that you're encountering in Pakistan. And let's hope that, that we'll see a lot more research and progress in policy.
Thank you very much, Dilip. We keep telling our Indian counterparts, some of our common friends, we should develop at least trade in ideas. Unfortunately, even the trade in ideas is very slow. For what reason, I don't know. But I've been in touch with several, including Raghu Rajan. Raghu promised to do that, but it's slow. So let's see if Raghu comes back as a minister. Maybe we'll do it. But thank you. It's very kind of you to take out time. We will call on you now and again. I think it's important. This is one way you can contribute to Pakistan. You're very much admired here. We appreciate you. We regard you as one of our own. So thank you, please, for turning up. And inshallah, one day we'll get you to Pakistan if you have the time.
Thank you. I really look forward to that. Yeah.
Thank you. All the
best.
Bye-bye.